You're live with Euronews as we wait for Russian President Vladimir Putin to address both houses in the Russian parliament in a special session that's been called about the situation in Crimea. A delegation of Crimea's new leaders are also attending. Earlier today, Putin informed Parliament formally of Crimea's request to join the Russian Federation, which is the first legal step towards absorbing Crimea. Putin also signed an order yesterday morning recognising Crimean independence. He's also approved a draft bill on the accession. The session's been called after the referendum on Sunday, in which Crimean officials say 97% of voters backed splitting for Ukraine. The figures you can see on the front row are the new leaders of Crimea. The lady there is the Speaker of the House. She's now a subject of US and EU sanctions and frozen assets and visa bans. So the EU and the US have declared the vote in Crimea illegal and, as I mentioned, imposed these sanctions, which include travel bans and asset freezes. Kiev has appealed to the international community not to recognise the result of the vote. There are 83 autonomous republics currently that are part of the Russian Federation, and Crimea would become the 84th. So far, 21 Russians and Ukrainians are the subject of sanctions by the EU and the US. The EU has said that the list is not limited to these people and could eventually include up to 120, 130 senior officials and politicians and business people and military commanders in Russia. So the formalities of making Crimea a part of the Russian Federation are expected to be completed by the 21st of March. But Russian ministers have said that the whole process could technically take 2 to 3 years. The man you can see in front of you now is the mayor of Moscow. Crimea's new parliament announced that as of the 1st of April, the currency in Crimea would be the Russian ruble. So we're waiting for Russian President Vladimir Putin to address both houses of the Russian parliament. That's the lower house, the State Duma, and the upper house, the Federation Council, in a special session that's been called after the referendum in Crimea voted in favour of Crimea becoming a part of Russia. Putin's expected to ask both houses to support a draft law which would incorporate Crimea as part of the Federation. Earlier today, he informed Parliament formally of Crimea's request to join the country, which is the first legal step towards the peninsula becoming part of Russia. In front of you it says the address of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. So we're expecting him to arrive now in the next few minutes. He's going to be addressing both houses in the Russian parliament in a special session that's been called over Crimea. They're announcing his arrival. The President of the Russian Federation, Putin, is arriving. Please, take a seat, Putin says.
Добрый день, уважаемые члены Совета Федерации.
Good afternoon, esteemed members of the Federation Council and members of the State Duma, and esteemed representatives of the Republic of Crimea, the Russian citizens of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. His comments clearly receiving loud applause and now a standing ovation. So he's called there the people of Crimea the citizens of Russia, which has drawn the standing ovation and applause. Thank you, Putin says. Dear friends, we've gathered today to discuss the question which is of vital and historic importance for all of us. On the 17th of March, there was a referendum in Crimea, although in fact it was on the 16th of March. And the referendum was totally in line with international law. 82% turnout and 96% in favour of joining Russia. Those figures are absolutely convincing, Putin says. In order to understand why they made this choice, one has to know the history of Crimea. One has to know what Crimea means to Russia. In Crimea, everything is saturated with our joint history. The ancient town of Chersonesus, where Prince Vladimir took Christianity 1,000 years ago. And this choice to accept Christianity is what unites the people of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus. The graves of Russian soldiers are in Crimea. Soldiers who died in the mid-19th century in the war against Turkey and England and France. And of course, Sevastopol is a city of Russian glory, where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is based, the Russian naval force. The cities of Balakava and Kerch in Crimea, sacred places to Russia and sacred to the Russian people. Crimea is an amalgamation of cultures and traditions and different peoples, and is so similar and to what the Russian Federation is, where so many different nations and nationalities live together. Russians and Ukrainians and Tatars have always lived shoulder to shoulder together in Crimea, preserving their own religions and their own traditions. There are 1.5 ethnic million Russians in Crimea, and Ukrainians who still use Russian as their first language, and almost 100,000 Crimean Tatars, and many of them support joining Russia. Yes, it's a black page in history when Crimean Tatars were the subject of repression. But of course, we have to remember there was a time when so many different nations suffered. And Crimean Tatars are not alone in that. So the process of rehabilitation of Crimean Tatars will be finished when Crimea joins Russia and we grant them full rights. We will restore their good name and their good historical past. It's their birthplace. And we want the Crimean Tatars to know that we will support them And of course, we will support the idea of having 3 official languages in Crimea: Russian, Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar language. Dear colleagues, in people's minds and hearts, Crimea always has been and is now a part of Russia. And from generation to generation, people gave this knowledge of Crimea being a Russian land, and any geopolitical changes and dramatic transformations in the former Soviet Union didn't change that. During the Bolshevik years in the 1920s, we won't analyze the reasons, but the Bolsheviks gave traditional Russian lands in the east and south of Ukraine to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic. And then in 1954, the then authorities gave Crimea to Ukraine. The initiator was the leader of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev. We don't know why he did it. Maybe he tried to hide his own personal responsibility for repressions in Ukraine in the 1930s. That's for historians to decide. But for us, it's clear that that decision was unconstitutional and illegal at the time.
Естественно, что в условиях тоталитарного государства у жителей Крыма и Севастополя ни о чем не спрашивали.
It was taken in a totalitarian state. Nobody asked the people of Crimea and the citizens of Sevastopol. Of course, many people have asked since then, why is Crimea in Ukraine? But I have to say,
ведь территории передавались в рамках одной большой страны. Тогда просто невозможно было
the decision people were taking as a formality,
могут быть не вместе.
Because there were no separate countries like Russia and Ukraine. They were living in one country, the Soviet Union. And we couldn't even imagine that Russia and Ukraine one day would be independent and different countries. Unfortunately, it became a reality. The Soviet Union collapsed and disintegrated, and history was moving so fast that people couldn't really understand and analyze the dramatic effect of what was happening. People in Russia and Ukraine and other former Soviet republics were hoping that the new formation, a new Commonwealth of independent states, would simply replace the Soviet Union. They were promised joint currency, joint armed forces, foreign policy. But they were just unfulfilled hopes. And a big joint federation simply disappeared. And when Ukraine illegally appeared as a different country, a foreign country, then Russia felt that it was robbed, that it was cheated. But we have to admit that Russia contributed to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And of course, in those turbulent years, people forgot about Crimea. People forgot about Sevastopol. Millions of ethnic Russians went to bed in one country and woke up in a different country. The Russian people became one of the biggest, if not the biggest, divided people in the world. Because ethnic Russians started living in many different countries. I've heard a lot of Crimea citizens say that in 1991, Crimea was given to Ukraine like a sack of potatoes. And of course, I can agree. And what did Russia do at that time? We swallowed our pride. Our country was in such a bad condition that we weren't in a position to defend our interests at that time. But people could still not take this historic injustice. And for all those years, the people, the citizens, the famous people in Russia, they always said that Crimea is historically Russian land and Sevastopol is a Russian city. And of course, yes, we understood with our hearts and minds, but we had to take into account the realities of politics. And we had to develop good neighbourly relations with Ukraine. And of course, and the relations were and will always be key and important for us. That's no exaggeration. It's of the utmost importance to preserve good relations with our Ukrainian brothers. I can share with you the details of some of the negotiations in early 2000 with the then president of Ukraine, Kuchma. We were discussing how to speed up the process of delimitation of the state border between Russia and Ukraine, because the process wasn't moving along. But I instructed all the Russian agencies to intensify their work to put actual limits on the borders with Russia and Ukraine. We understood at that time that if we completed the process of making the borders, we would lose Crimea forever. We also discussed the division of territorial waters in the Sea of Azov. We took into account at that time that the most important for us at that time was to preserve good brotherly relations between Ukraine and Russia. But of course, we assume that Ukraine will remain our closest ally, that ethnic Russian-speaking people in the east of Ukraine will live together with brotherly Russia, and that all their rights are respected according to international law. But as the situation started to develop in a different way, to assimilate ethnic Russians into Ukrainian society, to deprive the ethnic Russians of their historical knowledge, of their language. And of course, those people were suffering from the permanent crisis that's been going on in Ukraine for the last 20 years. I understand why people in Ukraine wanted change. In those years of independence, the authorities in Ukraine were so bad that people got sick of them, got tired of them. The prime ministers and presidents came and went, but there was no difference. They all tried to rob Ukraine, to steal from the people of Ukraine. They were fighting for money, for budget money, for resources. And the authorities never actually cared about the millions of ordinary people. This is why so many people from Ukraine, millions of them, go as guest workers to many countries abroad. Only in Russia last year we had at least 3 million Ukrainians as guest workers who were coming to Russia looking for jobs. And they transferred so much money back to Ukraine, almost 12% of Ukrainian GDP. I want to say it once again, I understand those people who were at the Maidan, who wanted to protest against poverty, against the lack of democracy, and the lack of transparency, and against dictatorship. But there are legitimate procedures like elections to change authorities. But those who were behind the last events in Kiev, they had different aims and goals. They organized a coup d'etat and to grab power without any legal procedures. They used terror and pogroms and using weapons and arms. The initiators of that coup d'etat were nationalists, anti-Semites, radicals, and people who hate Russians. This is why they tried to change the language law that deprived ethnic minorities in Ukraine of human rights.
властей сразу одернули.
And of course, the sponsors of those so-called authorities in the West,
Люди умные, надо
they said, yes, they're clever people.
к чему приведут попытки построить
They said to the new Ukrainian authorities,
государство. Законопроект
don't try ethnic cleansing in Ukraine.
но явно про запас.
So the law was cancelled so far
О самом факте его
to
существования
deprive the ethnic minorities of using their languages.
расчет на короткую человеческую память. Но уже всем
So in Ukraine, people don't mention now about that law, probably hoping that people will forget.
идейные наследники Бандеры, приспешника Гитлера во время
But for everyone, it is
войны,
understandable what they want.
что легитимный
They're the followers of the nationalists and the Nazi collaborator Bandera.
разговаривать не с кем.
And it's clear that there's no legitimate authority in Ukraine until now.
При этом
We don't have anyone to talk to.
ничего в стране не контролируют.
They call themselves the new leaders, but they don't control anything in the new country.
Контролем радикалов. Даже попасть на прием к некоторым министрам
They're controlled themselves by radicals.
можно только с разрешения боевиков Майдана. Это не шутка, это реалии сегодняшней жизни.
Even to get an appointment with some ministers of the so-called new Ukrainian government,
Эти репрессиями
you have to get permission from the radicals in Maidan
первым на очереди был, конечно,
and from armed gangs, the armed gangs who initiated Maidan.
в связи с этим жители Крыма и Севастополя
And of course, they want to expand their radical actions to different parts of Ukraine. The first target was Crimea,
еще происходит и в Киеве, и в Донецке, в Харькове.
and this is why the authorities of Crimea asked the Russian authorities to defend them and help them and protect them. We saw what was happening in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk, and of course, we couldn't abandon our people in Crimea. Otherwise, we would have been traitors. We couldn't reject their pleas for help, for protection.
Прежде всего, нужно
This is why we decided to help them.
свободного волеизъявления, чтобы крымчане могли сами определить свою судьбу. Первый раз в истории.
We have to ensure the proper conditions for self-determination so that the citizens of Crimea
Нам говорят, что мы нарушаем
could organise a free vote. And what we hear from our partners in Europe and in America,
существует международное право.
that we've violated international law, well,
Поздно, чем
it's
никогда.
a good thing that at least they remember there is such a thing as international law. Better late than never.
Ну и во-вторых, самое главное, что же мы якобы нарушаем?
And the most important thing,
Федерация,
what are we violating?
Верхняя палата парламента
Yes, the president of the Russian Federation
в Украине. Но этим правом, строго
got
говоря,
approval
даже не воспользовался.
from the upper house
Силы России
of the Russian parliament
Крым
to use armed forces in Ukraine, but we didn't use this right.
договором. Да, мы
The
усилили.
Russian forces did not go to Crimea.
Хочу это подчеркнуть, чтобы все знали и слышали.
We had legitimate Black Sea fleet
Численности наших вооруженных сил,
in Crimea already,
а она
but we didn't send extra troops.
1000 человек. В этом просто не было необходимости.
Yes, we sent some reinforcement,
Объявляя о своей
but
независимости,
the permitted maximum level of our troops is 24,000, and we didn't even reach that limit.
Объединенных Наций, в котором говорится о праве нации на
When the Crimea authorities declared the referendum,
Украины, хочу это напомнить, объявляя о
they quoted the United Nations Charter
то же самое.
that allows the self-determination of every people. And I want to remind you that when Ukraine decided to become independent, they did the same thing.
Почему?
They had a referendum
Крымские власти опирались и на известный косвенный,
in Ukraine in 1990,
который наши западные,
and now they deny the people of Crimea one. Why?
что называется, своими
Besides,
руками.
there is a so-called Kosovo precedent
Аналогичный
that
Крым
was created by the Western world,
Косово от Сербии легитимным, доказывая всем, что никакого
and
разрешения
the situation was absolutely identical to what's happening in Crimea. They separated Kosovo from Serbia and made it independent. And this is why
Международный суд
there's no need for any part of the country
статьи 1
to be recognized as independent.
наций согласился с этим.
This is according to the United Nations. That was the argument of our Western partners in the case of Kosovo
Следующее. Привожу дословную цитату.
in 2010.
Никакого общего запрета на одностороннее провозглашение независимости не вытекает.
Putin's now quoting the resolution of the United Nations.
И далее. Общее Общее международное право не содержит каких-либо
General international law
запрета на провозглашение независимости.
does not ban
Ясно. Я не люблю обращаться к цитатам, но
any territory from proclaiming and declaring its independence, so it's so clear.
официального документа.
I don't really like a lot of quotes and quotations,
От 17 апреля
but still, I'll quote something else.
в этот самый
It's a memorandum from the United States
Kosovo. Опять
when
процитирую.
they applied to the International Criminal Court
Могут, и часто так и происходит,
to support the idea of Kosovo's independence.
однако это не означает, что происходит нарушение
The
международного.
ruling of the court said that sometimes declarations of independence might violate
Раструбили на
the
весь мир.
legislation of some countries,
Теперь возмущаются.
but not international law.
Ведь действия
So
крымчан
they were pushing and pressing for that case, and they were trying to bend everyone,
действия крымчан
and now they have the audacity to criticize us.
в эту, собственно говоря, инструкцию.
We
Почему
can't understand it.
то, что можно албанцам,
And what the Crimean people did,
к ним с уважением, запрещается русским, украинцам и
what they did is totally in line with international law.
вопрос, почему?
So what the ethnic Albanians did in Kosovo was legitimate,
Kosovo это, мол, опять
and what the Russians and Ukrainians and Tatars did in Crimea is illegitimate. Why?
заключается
Now we hear from the United States that this is a special case, but what's so special in this case?
было много человеческих жертв. Это что, юридический правовой аргумент, что ли?
The difference, they say to us, is that during the conflict in Kosovo, there were a lot of victims, there was genocide. But is it really a legitimate
Это
argument?
даже уже не двойные стандарты. Это
There's no such thing in international law.
прямые линии
And it's not even double standards, it's just so primitive and so cynical now.
свои интересы. Сегодня один и тот же предмет сегодня называть
You can't just bend international law
Получается, нужно
to your own interests.
любой конфликт до человеческих жертв, что ли?
Yesterday they were calling something white, and today they're calling it black.
Силы самообороны Крыма вовремя не взялись,
So do you want every local conflict to have mass victims? I must say sincerely,
этого не случилось.
there would have been a lot of victims
Не произошло.
had the self-defense of Crimea taken the peninsula under their control. Thank goodness it didn't happen.
Произошло ни одного вооруженного столкновения и не было человеческих жертв.
There wasn't a single military confrontation in Crimea, and there were no victims in Crimea. Why is this? The answer is simple.
Воевать трудно или практически не.
Because it's very difficult to fight against the people and the people's will.
Поблагодарить.
Not just difficult, but almost impossible.
А это немалый контингент, 22 тысячи человек с полным
And
вооружением.
this is why I want to thank the Ukrainian military personnel in Crimea.
Не пошли на коробку.
And there are 22,000 Ukrainian troops in Crimea. I want to thank them for not starting to fire, for not starting any bloodshed. They avoided military confrontation,
Возникают и другие мысли. Нам говорят о какой-то
and they didn't put bloodstains
об
on them.
агрессии. Странно.
And now
Что-то не
it's being talked about that it was an intervention and aggression in Crimea.
единственного выстрела.
It's very strange for me.
Уважаемые коллеги,
I haven't heard a single example in history where intervention or aggression
отразилось то, что
took place without a single shot fired.
на протяжении последних десятилетий в мире. После исчезновения биполярной системы на планете не стало больше стабильности.
So what happened in Crimea is a reflection
Международные институты
of what happened in the world in the last couple of decades.
деградируют. Наши западные партнеры во главе с Соединенными Штатами Америки предпочитают в своей
There's no balance in the world anymore.
не международным правом, а правом сильного. Они уверовали в свою
Many of our partners in the West, especially the United States of America,
в то, что им позволено решать судьбы мира, что право могут быть всегда только они. Они
they
действуют
think not in terms of international law and right and wrong. They think about the right of might, the right of arms, the right of the one with
по
strength.
принципу «кто не с нами, тот против нас». Чтобы придать
They
агрессии
create
законность,
coalitions on the principle that those who are not with us are against us.
а если по каким-то причинам этого не получается, вовсе
They
игнорируют. И
press international organizations
в целом.
to adopt documents and resolutions.
Хорошо об этом помним. В 1990
That's what happened in Yugoslavia.
трудно было в это поверить, глазам.
And we remember it very well.
Но в конце 20 века по одной
It was difficult to believe what happened then.
в течение нескольких недель наносились ракетно-бомбовые удары.
But at the end of the 20th century, one of the European capitals, Belgrade, became an object of artillery and bombing and shelling.
Решающие такие действия. Ничего подобного.
And then what happened? Did we have a UN resolution allowing it?
Резолюция СБ
No.
по Ливии.
No UN resolutions.
Течение бесполетной,
What happened next?
называемой,
Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya.
была и целая череда управляемых цветных революций.
There was a resolution for a no-flight zone above Libya.
В странах, где
And what happened? They started firing and bombing.
от тирании, от нищеты, от отсутствия перспектив. Но эти чувства просто цинично использовались.
So people in those areas are just sick and tired of being
не соответствовали ни образу их жизни,
Forced.
ни традициям, ни культуре.
and being influenced and intimidated by the mighty United States and its allies.
Вспышки насилия
Instead of democracy and freedom, there is chaos, coup d'états,
арабской зимой.
the so-called Arab Spring.
Сценарий был реализован и на Украине. В 2004
The Arab Spring has now turned into Arab Winter.
нужного кандидата на
The same scenario was realised in Ukraine in 2004.
тур, который не
The so-called Orange Revolution,
просто абсурд и издевательство над Конституцией,
when they entered the third round of presidential elections.
готовленную, хорошо оснащенную армию
It's
боевых.
absurd.
Мы понимаем, что происходит. Понимаем, что эти действия были
And now they've created a well-equipped army of thugs and radicals and neo-Nazis.
И это в то время, когда
Those actions were against Russia,
к диалогу с нашими коллегами на Западе. Мы постоянно
against the integration of the post-Soviet area.
вопрос. Хотим
And
укреплять,
this was happening when Russia was offering dialogue and peace to everyone.
были
We
равными,
want to strengthen mutual trust.
но мы не
We
видим,
want the relations to be, with everyone, to be open and transparent and honest.
разом обманывали, принимали решения
But we didn't have any reciprocal steps taken.
с фактом. Так
The
было
decisions were taken behind our backs.
с размещением военных,
This was the case with NATO expansions to the east,
одно и то же твердили. Ну, вас это
the
не касается.
siphoning of military infrastructure at our borders.
Так было и с развертыванием
And they say, oh, it has nothing to do with you. Well, what do you mean it has nothing to do with us? Having the military might of NATO on our borders.
затягиванием переговоров по визовым проблемам, с обещаниями честной конкуренции и свободного доступа на глобальные рынки. Нам сегодня
They promised us visa liberalization.
ряда ограничений, и весьма
They
существенных
promised us
для нашей экономики. Для
trade concessions. They promised us
период холодной войны США, затем
a lot of things
другие страны,
regarding industrial cooperation, and it hasn't happened.
большой перечень технологий и оборудования, составив так
For
называемые
example,
омовские списки.
in
Сегодня
the times of the so-called Cold War,
только формально. На деле многие запреты по-прежнему действуют.
the United States
Все основания полагать, что
banned the sales of
политика
sensitive equipment to the then Soviet Union.
и в 18-м, и в 19-м, и в 20-м
They lifted those restrictions, but only in theory, and it still goes on.
нас постоянно пытаются загнать в какой-то угол. За то, что мы имеем независимую позицию, за то, что ее
Those
отстаиваем, за то,
balanced policies towards Russia still remain. We're punished
что мы не лицемерим.
for having
Но все имеет свои пределы.
our independent position,
И в случае с Украиной наши западные партнеры
that
перешли
we're not hypocritical, we're open and transparent.
безответственно и непрофессионально.
And now,
Они же прекрасно
in
знали,
the case of Ukraine, they just crossed the line. Western states just crossed the line. They were irresponsible and aggressive.
знали,
They
что
knew perfectly well
в Крыму живут миллионы русских людей.
that in Ukraine and in Crimea, there are a lot of Russian people,
И чувствуют
a lot of Russian-speaking people.
всех последствий своих действий. Россия оказалась на рубеже, от которого не могла уже отступить.
They've lost any sense of political understanding.
Пружину, она когда-нибудь с силой,
They didn't predict the Russian reaction.
надо помнить об этом.
You know, when you try to push the spring a lot,
Необходимо прекратить истерику
the spring will sooner or later recoil in your face.
и признать очевидную вещь. Россия
You
самостоятельный.
have to stop your hysteria and just admit
У нее как
that Russia is independent, active, and strong,
учитывать и
and a member of the international community. It has its own legitimate interests that have to be respected and taken into account.
при этом мы с благодарностью относимся ко всем, кто с пониманием
We are already thankful, of course, to those who understood our actions and our activities in Crimea. For example, to China, whose leadership
рассматривает ситуацию вокруг Украины и Крыма во всей ее исторической и политической полноте. Высоко ценим сдержанность.
wants to understand the situation in Ukraine.
Сегодня я хочу обратиться и к народу Соединенных Штатов Америки.
With all of its complexity and multifaceted realities, also India, who is trying to be neutral and objective.
Тем, что свобода для них превыше всего.
I also want to address the Americans, the United States.
Свободному выбору своей судьбы.
For them, freedom is above all. So why is the desire of the people of Crimea to be free, that's less valid than the sense of Americans to be free? You have to understand us, I hope, that the Germans and Europeans will understand us.
Мягко говоря, экспертам на очень высоком уровне представители
And I can remind you
которые являются
that when East and West Germany were united,
поддержали саму идею объединения, а наша страна, напротив,
there were some objections.
однозначно поддержала искренне.
People who thought the idea of reunification of East and West wasn't a good idea.
Что вы этого не забыли.
But our country supported it fully.
Что граждане Германии также поддержат
Yes, you have to become a reunified country again. Well, I hope that you haven't forgotten this. And I hope that you, the Germans, will now support the idea of Russian unity, the Russian world, the restoration of the historic Russian lands. I hope you'll support us. I also address the people of Ukraine. I honestly want you to understand us. We don't want to humiliate you. We don't want to harm you. We always respected the unity of Ukraine.
Но именно они сделали все, чтобы расколоть страну. Сегодняшнее гражданское противостояние целиком на их совести. Хочу, чтобы вы меня услышали, дорогие друзья. Не верьте тем, кто пугает вас Россией.
But it's those who support Ukrainian nationalism that are responsible for this split in Ukraine. Please don't trust those who now try to scare you that after Crimea, new territories will go to Russia. This is not true. But as to Crimea, Crimea always was Russian and Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar. And it will remain as such always, as it used to be for centuries. It will be a home for all nations, but it will never be Nazi Bandera, a reference to an alleged Nazi collaborator from Western Ukraine. So that was President Putin receiving strong applause there from the two houses at the Russian parliament. He continues. Crimea is our joint effort. It's a strategic territory. And this territory has to become part of stable, strong, an international player, and such a player can only be Russia today. Otherwise, dear friends, all of us, Russians and Ukrainians, can lose Crimea altogether. If you do not accept what happened, we can lose Crimea altogether. I have to remind you that already we have calls from Ukraine to join NATO. What does it mean? What does that mean for Russia and Crimea? That in Sevastopol, the city of Russian glory, there would be NATO warships. And this could have happened in reality. but for the choice of the Crimean people, and we thank them for that. Crimea cannot be part of NATO.
Кстати говоря, мы не против сотрудничества с НАТО. Совсем нет.
By the way, we're not against cooperation with NATO, but we're against the military alliance.
Мы против того, чтобы военная организация хозяйничала возле нашего забора, рядом с нашим домом или на наших исторических территориях. Вы знаете,
we're strictly against the foreign military alliance
к натовским
and then becoming masters in our historic territories. I can't even imagine that we could travel to Crimea as guests to NATO military personnel. By the way, many of them are good guys, good people, but I'd rather that they come to us as guests. Of course, I'm suffering personally. My heart bleeds for people in Crimea, for what's happening now in Crimea. I've said many times that we're practically one people. Kiev is the mother of Russian cities historically. The ancient Rus is our joint source. We couldn't live without one another, never, ever. Millions of ethnic Russians, Russian-speaking people will live in Ukraine, and Russia will always defend their interests with political, diplomatic and legal means. Always. But, first of all, Ukraine itself should be interested to guarantee the interests and rights of those people, and that will guarantee stability of Ukraine, of Ukrainian integrity and territorial unity. We want friendship with Ukraine. We want it to be strong and stable. It's one of our most important partners in the economy and everything, in culture. And we believe in the success of the Ukrainian people. We wish them peace and prosperity. And we will offer our hand. We offer all our assistance to help Ukraine. But again, it's for the people of Ukraine to put their house in order. Dear people of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, the whole of Russia was applauding your courage and your actions. It was you, the people, who decided your own destiny. We're close as never before. We've supported each other. And there are sincere feelings of solidarity. And such historic moments are testing. Oh, it's difficult to gauge the soul of the people. And the people of Russia showed solidarity and inner strength when supporting their brothers in Crimea. The strong position of Russia on foreign relations was based on the wishes and feelings of millions of Russians. And I want to thank all Russians for this patriotic feeling. And it's important for us to preserve this consolidated feeling. Of course, we'll have some obstacles now in the world, but for us, we have to decide once and for all whether we'll stand firm or surrender.
Действия некой пятой колонны разного рода национал-предателей или рассчитывать, что смогут ухудшить социально-экономическое положение.
Now some Western countries threaten not only sanctions, but they predict economic troubles and inner troubles in Russia. I don't understand what they mean.
И будем соответствующим образом на это реагировать.
Because this is quite aggressive, and we will react to this very strongly. I want to repeat again, we're not seeking confrontations with our partners in the West or in the East. We will do our best to build and maintain
Уважаемые коллеги,
good, friendly relations.
понимаю крымчан, которые поставили вопрос на референдуме предельно прямо,
As is the general rule of international coexistence now.
либо с Россией. И можно
So there was a clear choice in Crimea,
Крыма и Севастополя. Депутаты законодательных органов
whether they wanted to be with Russia or with Ukraine.
референдума поднялись над группой
And it was very clear
интересами и руководствовались во главу угла, поставили
that when they were formulating these questions on the referendum, they were putting the interests of people and not
плебисцит.
political ambitions at the forefront.
Он не казался на первый взгляд в силу исторических, демографических, политических и
Any other form of referendum
территории был
would have been
временным и зыбким. Неизбежно привел бы
would have been only interim
к ситуации вокруг Крыма.
and not very solid,
Пагубным образом отразился бы на жизни людей.
and it would have led again to some further confrontations,
Бескомпромиссно,
and it would affect people. So
полутонов.
the Crimeans decided to put the question very clearly. The referendum was open, fair and transparent and honest,
Выразили свою волю.
and people in Crimea
Они хотят быть с Россией.
gave a strong answer. They want to be with Russia.
России также предстоит принять сложное решение, учитывая всю совокупность и
For
внутренних,
Russia,
и внешних факторов. Каково же сейчас мнение людей в России?
it's still necessary to take very difficult decisions because of internal and, of course, external factors.
Но позиция
In
абсолютно,
our society, there are different points of view,
также очевидна. Вы знаете, последние
but the absolute majority of people
были проведены
are absolutely clear.
на днях. Порядка 95% граждан считают, что Россия должна
In all the opinion polls of the last few days, almost 95% of our people confirm
в Крыму.
that the Russian state has to protect the interests of Russian-speaking people and ethnic Russians in Crimea and in other areas.
93% полагают, что Россия должна это делать, даже если такая позиция осложнит наши отношения с некоторыми государствами. 80%
And they agree that Russia has to do it even if our actions might complicate our relations
нашей страны убеждены,
with
что
some countries.
до сих пор является российской территорией.
86% of our citizens are still convinced that Crimea is historically Russian land.
Она абсолютно коррелирует
And one more
в Крыму на референдум.
important figure.
92% выступают за присоединение.
Almost 92% support the idea of Crimea joining the Russian Federation.
Таким образом, и подавляющее большинство жителей Крыма, и абсолютное большинство граждан Российской
So the absolute majority of Crimean people
Республики Крым и города
and
Севастополя с
the
Российской
absolute
Федерацией
majority of people in the Russian Federation support the idea of reunification of Crimea and Sevastopol with the Russian Federation. So Russian President Vladimir Putin receiving a standing ovation there from both houses of the Russian parliament. He's just addressed about the situation in Crimea, explaining that Crimea has historically, in the minds of Russians, always been part of Russia.
самой России. А оно,
Putin continues, now it's up to the political decision of Russia itself.
потому что только народ и
And this political decision can only be based on the will of the people, because only the people are the source of governance.
уважаемые депутаты Государственной Думы, граждане
So
России,
it
жители
seems,
Крыма и Севастополя. Сегодня, основываясь
so esteemed
на референдуме,
members of parliament and citizens of Crimea,
опираясь на волю народа,
based on the results of the referendum
Федеральное собрание и
and based on the will of the people,
закон о принятии в состав России
I ask Parliament
объектов Федерации, Республики
to
Крым,
consider the draft law
Севастополь.
of asking the Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol to join the Russian Federation. That would be the draft law, which I ask you to support.
Ратифицировать подготовленный для подписания договор о вхождении Республики Крым и города Севастополь в Российскую Федерацию. Не сомневаюсь в поддержке.
I ask you to support the ratification of the agreement about Crimea joining the Russian Federation. That was President Putin addressing the Russian parliament.
Состоится церемония подписания. Просьба оставаться на своих местах.
So Putin has just asked Parliament to consider a draft law. So they're now expected to sign a draft treaty, which has already been ratified. It's about the Republic of Crimea, which has proclaimed its independence, and Sevastopol as a separate entity to join the Russian Federation. This is the speakers of both houses of Parliament and the Prime Minister. So President Putin has now left the stage together with the Speaker of the Crimean Parliament and the new Prime Minister of Crimea and the Mayor of Sevastopol, the self-proclaimed Mayor of the city of Sevastopol. They went off stage, and it's understood that they will be at a signing ceremony, either in the same hall or nearby. It's expected to be broadcast from there, a signing ceremony. So as of now, there are 83 autonomous republics, 83 subjects that are part of the Russian Federation. The Republic of Crimea will become number 84, and the city of Sevastopol will become number 85 as a separate entity. In Ukraine, the city of Sevastopol was already a separate legal entity, and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea was part of Ukraine, and the city of Sevastopol was a separate entity within the Ukrainian legal framework. And apparently this is what's going to be happening within the Russian Federation. So both Crimea and the city of Sevastopol will be joining the Russian Federation. It follows the controversial referendum in Crimea at the weekend, where Crimean officials say that 97% of the population, or 97% of those who voted, were in favour of Crimea joining the Russian Federation. We've been watching President Putin address both houses of Parliament about Crimea becoming a part of the Federation, and he asked ministers to consider signing the draft law and to sign the draft treaty, which would bring Crimea and the city of Sevastopol under the Russian Federation.
Дамы и господа, мы продолжаем наше мероприятие, поэтому просьба занять свои места.
So earlier on, Russian President Vladimir Putin talked about the historical significance of Crimea to Russia and how it always remained part of the collective consciousness that it was a part of Russia, that Russian soldiers were buried there and that ethnic Russians lived there. So the referendum on Sunday was, of course, controversial. Crimean officials said that 97% of voters backed splitting with Ukraine. The EU and the US declared it illegal and have begun imposing sanctions on various government officials and other figures in Russia, Crimea and Ukraine. They include travel bans and asset freezes. So now they're preparing to sign the formal treaty, an already ratified formal treaty about Crimea and the city of Sevastopol to join the Russian Federation. Making Crimea the 84th subject of the Russian Federation and Sevastopol the 85th. Ukraine, of course, appealed to the international community not to recognise the result of the vote in Crimea. That's the president of Chechnya there, a former rebel who switched sides to Putin and is now seen as a hero of Russia, one of the most ardent of Putin's supporters. So the music's playing now. We're expecting the return of Putin and new leaders of Crimea for a signing ceremony. They're the flags of the Russian Federation and the flag of Crimea and the flag of the city of Sevastopol.
Начинается церемония подписания.
The ceremony, the signing ceremony, is about to start. That was the announcement. There's Putin. To his left is the Speaker of the Crimean Parliament, and to his right, the taller man, is the Prime Minister of Crimea. And the final man, the one not wearing a tie in black, is the Mayor of Sevastopol, the self-proclaimed Mayor of Sevastopol.
Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин, председатель Государственного совета Республики Крым, парламента Республики Крым Владимир Андреевич Константинов и председатель Совета министров Республики Крым Сергей Валерьевич Аксенов, уполномоченные представители Республики Крым, Алексей Михайлович Чалый, уполномоченный представитель города Севастополя, подписывают договор между Российской Федерацией и Республикой Крым о принятии в Российскую Федерацию Республики Крым
в
составе Российской Федерации новых субъектов.
About the new subjects of the Russian Federation, that they've now been created, the Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. So So left to right, the Prime Minister of Crimea, the Speaker of Crimea, Vladimir Putin, and the self-proclaimed Mayor of Sevastopol. Of course, receiving much applause, as you can hear and see there. The referendum on Crimea was declared illegal by Ukraine, by the EU and by the US. The Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol have been signed in by law to become a part of the Russian Federation, making them the 84th and the 85th autonomous republic to be a part of the Federation, with 83 already existing. Earlier, Putin addressed both houses in the Russian parliament, telling them why Crimea was so important to Russia, how historically it had always been thought of as part of Russia and how it had now returned. Time now to take a look at some more of today's news.